Close your eyes for a moment. Picture Broadway, not the one you know today, with neon lights, towering billboards, and the endless flow of taxis and tourists. No, picture Broadway in the 1860s. The most famous street in New York City was already alive, already central to the city's identity. But it was nothing like today. Forget Times Square. Forget theater marquees blazing in the night. Broadway then was a mix of elegance and chaos, grandeur and grime. A place where horse-drawn omnibuses rattled down cobblestones and gas lamps cast dim light through the haze of smoke. This is the story of Broadway in the 1860s. A story of contrasts, of spectacle and squalor, of soldiers returning from war and merchants chasing fortunes, of carriages clogging the street and pickpockets slipping through the crowds. By the end, you'll never look at modern Broadway the same way again. The 1860s were not just another decade in New York. They were defined by the Civil War. While battles raged across the country, Broadway carried on as both the city's main artery and its public stage. Parades of volunteers marched down it, drums beating, flags waving, as families stood on the sidewalks cheering or weeping. Later, Broadway became the parade ground for soldiers returning victorious, crowds packing the streets so tightly that traffic came to a halt. But Broadway wasn't only about war. It was commerce, too. Storefronts spilled open onto the sidewalks. Milliners displayed extravagant hats. Clothiers boasted imported fabrics. Jewelry shops glittered with gaslight bouncing off polished cases. Shoppers walked shoulder to shoulder, brushing past beggars and street vendors hawking oysters, roasted chestnuts, and penny newspapers. The air smelled of smoke, manure, and perfume all at once. Today, when you say Broadway, people think of musicals. But in the 1860s, Broadway's entertainment was very different. There was no theater district yet. Instead, theaters were scattered along the avenue, and they staged Shakespeare, operas, vaudeville acts, and melodramas. The most famous theater of the time was Niblo's Garden, near Prince Street. There, audiences marveled at elaborate productions, some with live horses on stage. A few blocks away, Barnum's American Museum offered oddities, giants, midgets, exotic animals, and curiosities that blurred the line between science and spectacle. Families flocked there as much for education as for entertainment, though not everyone believed Barnum's claims. And when night fell, Broadway itself became a spectacle. Gas lamps lined the street, glowing yellow against the dark. Carriages rattled past as couples strolled, ladies lifting their skirts above the mud, gentlemen tipping their hats. It was the closest thing New York had to a promenade, a place to see and be seen. But don't romanticize it too much. Broadway in the 1860s was crowded, noisy, and often dangerous. The horse-drawn omnibuses that ran up and down the avenue were always full, their wooden benches crammed with passengers. Conductors clung to the back steps, shouting for fares. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone was constant, and accidents were common. Horses slipped, carriages collided, and pedestrians darted between wheels at their own risk. Street cleaning was primitive. Manure piled up quickly, only to be swept aside by underpaid laborers. In summer, the smell was overpowering. In winter, the slush turned Broadway into a slick hazard. Still, people came, because Broadway was the heartbeat of New York, even when it reeked. One of the most striking things about Broadway in the 1860s was the sharp contrast between wealth and poverty. Elegant brownstone hotels, like the St. Nicholas, stood just blocks from shabby boarding houses. Wealthy families arrived in polished carriages, while immigrants trudged on foot, selling apples or matches for a living. You could walk a few blocks and pass a banker in a tailored coat, a newsboy shouting headlines, a soldier missing a leg from the war, and a pickpocket eyeing his next victim. Broadway didn't hide these contrasts. It put them on display. To walk the avenue was to witness the extremes of American society at the time. Broadway as the nation's stage. because Broadway was also the stage for America's emotions. Political rallies filled its sidewalks, with banners strung across the street. After Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the funeral procession moved down Broadway. Silent crowds gathered in mourning, their grief palpable. Just a few years later, celebrations for victory parades or election results turned the same avenue into a sea of cheering voices. Broadway amplified whatever the moment was: joy, sorrow, anger, pride. It was where the city came together, whether in triumph or despair. Broadway was also a place of temptation. Beyond the respectable stores, there were gambling dens tucked away on side streets, and saloons that never closed. Prostitutes walked openly, dressed to catch the eye of passing men. Respectable families knew which blocks to avoid at night. Still, commerce ruled the day. Broadway was lined with dry goods stores that competed for the latest fabrics and fashions. Advertisements painted on buildings shouted about the lowest prices in the city. Newspapers sold by street boys kept citizens updated not only on the war, but on the latest scandals. And always, the sound of pianos drifted from music shops, blending with the cries of vendors and the rumble of wheels. Imagine yourself walking down Broadway in the 1860s. You'd begin near Bowling Green, where the oldest part of the city still lingered. The buildings were shorter, crowded, many of them dating back to the colonial era. As you moved north, the architecture grew grander: hotels, theaters, department stores. Above Canal Street, the city began to thin out, with more residences, though commerce was rapidly pushing northward. By the time you reached Union Square, you'd have passed soldiers, shoppers, beggars, actors, bankers, and newsboys. You'd have stepped around puddles of slop, dodged carriages, and been jostled by crowds. And you'd know why Broadway was unlike any other street in America. So why was Broadway in the 1860s nothing like today? Because it was raw, unfiltered, and chaotic, in ways modern Broadway no longer is. Today's Times Square is loud and commercialized, yes, but it is also sanitized, regulated, and safe compared to the dangers of the 19th century. Back then, Broadway wasn't just about entertainment. It was about survival. It was about a city redefining itself in the midst of war, wealth, poverty, and change. It was dirty, crowded, dangerous, and thrilling. Broadway in the 1860s was a mirror of New York itself. Brilliant yet filthy, glamorous yet grim, full of promise and peril. To walk its length was to experience the extremes of life in America's greatest city. And while today's Broadway dazzles with electric lights and billion-dollar musicals, its heart still beats with the energy it had back then. The energy of a street that has always been the stage where New York performs itself. If you enjoyed stepping back into the gritty, chaotic past of Broadway, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Good Old New York for more immersive journeys through the city's forgotten history.